Hi everyone, this is Toby from the International Association for Political Science Students, and we are here again live from San Francisco at the annual convention of the International Studies Association. And right now I'm really happy to have next to me on my left side Erika DeKranes, who is working for the Coalition for Peace Action and who's actually doing research right now on political science and social media, the two topics. What exactly is your paper about that you present here?
Hi, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is my first time presenting at the ISA convention and also my first time doing a Facebook Live interview, so very exciting. My paper looks at the role of social media and how it impacts political marches, particularly how it can be used as a tool and how it's both beneficial as well as not always as helpful in certain aspects of mobilization and framing.
Mm-hmm. I was just coming across this the story. This happened last week. So just some days back, one survivor of the parklet shooting, David Hogg, was verbally attacked by Laura Ann Graham, a Fox News host. And as a result of what happened, Hogg linked all 12 advertisers of the show of Laura Graham in a tweet and demanded them to boycott the show. 11 of the 12 companies reacted within 36 hours, and Laura Ann Graham immediately went on holidays, and there was a huge shitstorm following. So my question is, are social media protests becoming so effective that they become the new form of protesting?
I think with social media protests, both those that happen exclusively online as well as those that happen in conjunction with physical protests or marches, it really depends on the situation as to how effective they can be. Social media is particularly helpful in getting the word out to the most amount of people at the fastest rates. So that can be really helpful, like in this example, to immediately cause a big publicity situation. Where it's not as helpful as sometimes is in demanding specific political action and to show a physical display of support, which I think is still a very powerful aspect of activism. So I think it can be a great addition. I don't think on its own it's the most effective form of activism, but it's definitely something that has been utilized as a tool in the current social media age.
Why is it not the most effective form?
I think for a couple of reasons. Primarily with social media, one of the interesting aspects of it is the fact that people can take up a march or take up a cause and frame it in their own personalized and individualized aspect. So it creates this two-way conversation and really a more horizontal form of activism, which, like I said, is great for publicity. It's great for aiding and also being an additional tool for a current social movement. However, on its own, it's not always, if you don't have the structure to back that up, to call for specific political change and to really show a unified message, it's not going to be the most effective medium. So you need that organizing support in addition to the social media.
So that is actually pretty interesting because you work on both sides. You're an activist and you're a researcher. And how have those things that you have been researching on contributed to what you know about how activists can learn when using social media?
The two areas that I particularly utilized research background now in my professional life is in resource mobilization and framing. So learning how social media can be used to gain a great audience, to share tips and tools for march organizing, also to create event pages and really a cost-effective way to reach new audiences, but at the same time also recognizing how you need to keep how you need to frame issues and frame your political objectives in a very specific light and make sure that your followers are also doing that. And probably the biggest takeaway that I've had from this research is realizing that social movement organizations still need to exist in order to then utilize the tool of social media. So we still need vertical structures that exist independently of just the online presence.
Mm-hmm. How does that relate to the paper that you present here?
So in this paper, I look at social movement theory, particularly in, like I said, resource mobilization and in framing, but I also look at the idea of personalization of politics and how that's a trend, which just, I believe social media is following that trend. And I also relate it to several case studies. Mm-hmm. So in particular, I look at the Women's March, the People's Climate March, and the Women's March to Ban the Bomb, and I offer several suggestions for future march organizing as well.
Mm-hmm. Which kind of suggestions are these?
So primarily the fact that we need to back up any kind of social media organizing and physical march organizing with specific legislative political objectives. So in a few of the marches that I examined, there was not any kind of unified call for political change, especially within the context of national political structures. And I think that's really important in order to see effective change done. That's probably been one of my biggest suggestions. My other suggestion was that what I kind of already touched on a little bit was the fact that you still need existing social movement organizations in order to effectively utilize Twitter and Facebook and all forms of social media. So you still need those structures in conjunction with social media.
Mm-hmm. So would you define yourself then as an optimist when it comes to social media? So that you're looking on the capacities that your movements or the movement you're supporting, for example, can gain then?
Definitely. I mean, as a researcher, I'm definitely critical when I look at these tools, especially in my paper. But I do offer some kind of rays of hope in there, particularly with the Women's March movement, because when I originally participated and observed that movement, I was worried that there was not enough of a focus. Mm-hmm. However, in the 2018 women's marches, the organizers focused on much more specific political objectives. So instead of just, this general feminist, anti-Trump, a very fractured agenda, they've now focused on this idea of power to the polls. So electing more women and also having more women voters. So I thought that they recognized that this was a great movement, but that they needed to focus it more and structure it more. And they became an organization from this. Also, I recently attended the March for Our Lives in Washington, D.C., and I was also really heartened because the students who organized that solicited help from experienced organizers, and they made sure that interspersed within the actual march activities, they also talked about specific legislation that they wanted to see happen. So they had these great PSA messages in the middle of the march calling for things like universal background checks and increasing the age for gun ownership. So I am heartened by this. I just think it's still developing and that we need to look at the most effective ways we can use social media and not just rely on it independently without really having a strategy.
Mm-hmm. Looking on the ways that social media can be corrupted, so for example through bots or through other external influence, do you see that there are certain threats also that emerge that have to be kept under stronger political control, kind of, to have this function of civil society working and social media being functioning as well in the future?
Well, I wouldn't want to see any increased political control in social media. Some of the examples during my research that I looked at, specifically the book Twitter and Tear Gas, talks about the role of social media and how it can be affected negatively and actually become a venue itself for activism. So that was a little bit out of my sphere because of the marches I looked at were all within the United States, where we have a degree of freedom on the internet. I will say, though, one thing that we have to be careful with getting corrupted, because social media is so horizontal, people can create their own events or their own support for these marches and these movements, but then completely add their own messaging. For example, the People's Climate March, which I looked at, most accounts, official accounts of the march, say that there were no satellite or sister marches, so marches in other locations. However, if you go on their Facebook, there's tons of additional event pages, and the news media even reported on some. So you kind of blur the distinction of what is official and unofficial. So it's great that more people can participate, but it's also difficult to determine what the main goals are if people are also creating their own events independently.
If you look at the marches itself, I mean, you have given us some insight into how the march in DC was kind of not only organized by the students, but also by professionals. Do you observe other alterations and changes within traditional ways of protesting through social media?
I think there's a few aspects that have changed, specifically the messaging and signage of the marches. So I compared, in my paper, I looked at past marches, pre-social media marches. And with the more specified goals, signage and really that type of messaging stayed very consistent, whereas with these marches, both on and offline messaging was much broader. So I thought that was really interesting. Also, I think it's still going back to the organizing structure. There's much more of a back and forth that there wasn't when you had more vertical organizing. For instance, with the Women's March, there was a lot of debate on Facebook about the racial dynamic and white privilege. And as a result of that debate, one of the goals of the marches, which they called the unity principles, they added Black Lives Matter to that. So that, I think, is also this back and forth communication between organizers and the participants having much more of a role in the actual say of what direction the march is going. I think that's something new.
Okay. I want to talk a bit about your personal involvement in this interesting dynamic that you are also an activist and a scholar. How do you feel about it? Do you consider yourself more an activist, more a researcher?
At the moment, I do feel more of an activist, especially given the current political situation here in the United States and elsewhere. I think it's important that we really increase the amount of voices that are, that are being recognized in our country, and really be able to get our beliefs and political objectives out there. I would be open to continuing research on this concept. I know I plan to continue being an activist and going to marches, so I think as my experience increases, I'll probably have more to write about, especially with my work with the Coalition for Peace Action and also my work with Women's Space. We definitely have work on a variety of issues that I'm looking forward to continuing.
What exactly is your work on women's rights about?
So I currently work for an organization called Women's Space, which deals with domestic and sexual violence, specifically in New Jersey. They're not an overtly political organization. However, they are part of a larger coalition, which does deal with legislative issues in New Jersey. One thing that we've been particularly interested in lately is the birth of the Me Too movement, as well as the relationship between gun violence and domestic violence. So there's been some important legislation in New Jersey about that, which I was active on.
When you work on these concepts, what do you find more interesting when it comes to especially hashtag movements? To join hashtag movements in a way that that it gives voice, or do you join with the critical approach to think like, I want to frame and to reframe these hashtags, if you know what I mean? Because most hashtags have an initial idea, and very often there are a lot of transformations of these ideas.
That's very true, and I think you know, based on my research and my paper, I was very critical. However, I am optimistic that you know, when professional organizers and you know, other people who are organizing and they gain experience with this, we can frame hashtags in order to really get out important political ideas. But of course, we have to be careful. Anyone who's ever clicked on a hashtag knows there's a whole bunch of things that pop up that often are not related to that idea at all. So it can be powerful, but we also want to make sure that it's you know, specific to our political goals.
And talking about your recent work, how do you connect, for example, in your work for women's rights, how do you connect this work with your academic experience? Like, give us a practical example, maybe.
So with my academic experience, I was, prior to working as an activist, I studied global affairs and international relations, specifically with peace building and transnational security. So really looking at the ways, specifically when it comes to women's issues, looking at the ways that legislation can be used to protect both domestically and internationally. So I did some lobbying as well, and that was very relevant. I think the gun violence with women's issues was a really important one, where we actually lobbied and looked at the ways this has affected women in New Jersey, in the United States, and worldwide. And that was kind of a linkage between my global affairs experience, my activism experience, and now my experience with a women's organization.
When you then look, especially on Twitter, and as we were talking about hashtags, there are through Twitter different communities that are also constructed. So you have different parts of the user groups who come together and have certain opinions, who follow certain discourses. You have talked about how you can mobilize this very community that you're working in, and how you can push this. Is there also work on how to create awareness among these groups that are distancing them from other parts? You know, talking about the entanglement of different parts of society who do not hear anymore from each other.
I think part of the important thing when it comes to social media communities is having contact outside of social media. I know that's kind of a contradiction in itself, but at the same time, it's really important to have these physical or even additional conversations. For example, with the climate march, we had a whole bunch of different groups who were working together on that. But in addition to social media, there were some conference calls held. I thought that there could have been more in-person meetings. So I think kind of going back to some traditional organizing aspects could really get more people on the same page.
Thank you very much for taking the time talking to us today. I enjoyed it a lot, and I hope that many of you did as well. We are, as you can see right now, have a very nice spot on the 40th floor looking at the skyline of San Francisco, and I want to thank you for being here today with us and to share all your research.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited for this convention.
Thank you.